Of the strange research to come out of mid-1900s America, there is little with a legacy as enduring or as terrifying as the mouse Utopia experiments. Taking place throughout the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, the grim fate of the subjects was published in the national magazine Scientific American, and the experiments themselves were largely taken as apocalyptic portents. In a post-war United States, the language used to describe the results such as behavior sync became synonymous with fears of an overpopulated world and violent, deviant behavior in cities. Today, they are preserved within fiction such as Channel 4's conspiracy thriller Utopia and the classic animated movie The Secret of NIMH.
That was a good movie.
Began changing.
So what were the mouse Utopia experiments? Shortly after World War II, a group known collectively as the Environmentalists were making a large push to prevent environmental degradation, as well as overexploitation of the planet's renewable resources. Among these people were a group specifically known as the Neo-Malthusians, a term referring to the 18th and 19th century English scholar Thomas Robert Malthus. Malthus proposed that, while the world's population may increase exponentially, food production can only increase linearly, leading to an eventual subsistence-level existence for the human race that became known as a Malthusian catastrophe. While advancements such as the Green Revolution saw that this didn't come about, the Neo-Malthusians acknowledged his concerns about overpopulation and feared that this pattern would result in the collapse of civilization or, at best, have extreme adverse effects. These fears were given a platform in writing of the time, especially in works such as William Folkt's Road to Survival in 1948, and perhaps most famously, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson in 1962. Before the movement's explosion of popularity in the 50s and 60s, however, researchers had already begun work investigating the effects of population growth, and among them was a man named JohnB.Calhoun. Born in 1917, Calhoun took an early interest in science.
We all know that people in the early 1900s were way smarter than we are today.
Specifically ornithology,
they just knew way more.
His first paper on birds when he was 15, but over time, his interest would change. By the time he received his PhD, his focus had turned to ethology, the study of animal behavior. When his education was concluded, he moved with his family to Towson, Maryland, to begin research at Johns Hopkins University in nearby Baltimore, but the research itself would be conducted much closer to home. In 1947, shortly after he arrived, he approached his neighbor about using some of their neglected property for an experiment. The scope would be massive, and according to Calhoun, his neighbor probably didn't expect such a scale when they agreed to let him use the forested area. Taking over a quarter of an acre,
Hey bro, do you care if I, I'm just running some, I'm just a humble little scientist. Here's my book that I wrote. I just wonder if I could use some of your land, just a little bit, just to run an experiment, That's all.
Calhoun constructed a massive habitat, complete with food, water, ample shelter, and protection from predators, with the only limiting condition being their restriction to the quarter-acre living space. He affectionately provided his enclosure a name, Rat City. Unfortunately, no publicly available images of Rat City exist. Calhoun was very familiar with Norway rats, having performed research on them for his doctorate, and he estimated that Rat City could sustain approximately 5,000 individuals.
That was weird.
If they reached this number, the population density would be tight. He began by
China's invading. Look at the numbers. Closed captions and automatically in Chinese now.
placing 5 pregnant females in the enclosure, providing ample genetic diversity, and soon the population was increasing exponentially. But then something surprising happened. Rather than the population increasing to fill the space of the enclosure, it quickly leveled off at 150 members. He also noted some behavioral peculiarities. Despite the large size of Rat City, the residents seemed to gather around just a few places, forming social groups of 12 and limiting themselves to specific feeding locations. He would conclude the experiment after 2 years and 4 months, during which the population never grew over 200. Careful observation revealed the cause: high infant mortality. For some reason, as the experiment progressed and the population increased, the mothers were not caring for their young properly, leading to most of them dying before reaching maturity. Calhoun had his theories as to why this was, but to prove them, he would need more data.
Hey man, do you care if I use a little bit more of your yard? It's just for an experiment. Definitely not more rats. Yeah. Dude, let me guess. The reason why, look, it makes sense. The rats are in a small area, tight quarters. You know, I mean, there's an old saying, and I might be misquoting it, but I got the general idea of it. It's basically, there's a story of a snake that's put into a cage, like a glass container, and the owner was like, had it in this container from a baby. It was a small snake, and the owner grew concerned over time and was like, something's wrong with my snake. It's not getting any bigger. Like, it's supposed to be much bigger than this. It's like a dwarf. And she took it in, and the shop owner asked her, what size container do you have? And she explained, and he said, oh, that's the issue. She said, what do you mean? And he said, snakes limit their growth based off of their environment. So she needed to get in a much bigger cage so that it would grow, and she did. And lo and behold, the snake began to grow in size. That is true with anything. So that's true with like your mental state, the things you believe in. That's true with population. I mean, if you have a house that's got 7 bedrooms, do you really think like, do you think like your family, if they never move out, you're just generationally going to keep growing if everybody stays in that house? Probably not. Food's going to be more scarce. Space is going to be more scarce. Disease is going to be more it's going to propagate more than it did before because there's more people in a tight location. Cleanliness is going to be reduced because there's more foot traffic, more people in the area. So there's a lot of reasons why that could happen.
In 1954, about 5 years after his initial experiment concluded, he was hired by the National Institute of Mental Health, often shortened to NIM. Within the laboratory of psychology, Calhoun was given ample resources to continue his work. With a team, he began feverishly designing and constructing habitats, sometimes referred to as universes, where he performed numerous smaller-scale and more controlled versions of his original rat study on a domesticated strain of albino Norway rat. These rats would want for nothing. All physical needs for a healthy rat lifestyle would be provided for them, including food, water, climate control, and nesting material. Calhoun spent 8 years perfecting his enclosures and methods until finally, in February of 1962, an article of his writing was published in the magazine Scientific American. The article was entitled Population Density and Social Pathology. His opening paragraph ominously reads so, quote, "In the celebrated thesis of Thomas Malthus, vice and misery impose the ultimate natural limit on the growth of populations. Students of the subject have given most of their attention to misery, that is, to predation, disease, and food supply as forces that operate to adjust the size of a population to its environment. But what of vice? Setting aside the moral burden of this word, what are the effects of the social behavior of a species on population growth, and of population density on social behavior?" Unquote. To answer this question, he cited 6 of his experiments in particular, all with similar composition and concerningly similar results. The design of these habitats was simple. The layout was a rectangle measuring 10 feet by 14 feet, divided into 4 equal sections by electric fences.
Holy
3 of
shit.
these fences sported bridges over which the rats could climb, while one fence lacked such a bridge, essentially creating one long space that wrapped in on itself. Each section was equipped similarly, with a food hopper, water, and nesting areas accessible by spiral stairs.
This is a wild social experiment. There's going to be a lot of overlap between, I can already tell, between like how our society and how things are designed and how these rats operate in their environment. This is going to be really cool.
Staircases. But Calhoun, leveraging his experience with the rats, made special changes to encourage specific behaviors. He enticed the rats to use one of the center pens by making the spiral staircase to that pen's living spaces shorter than the others, though he admits this was a comparatively small factor. But the more insidious change was to their food supply. In half of the experiments, Calhoun supplied powdered food, but in the other half he placed feeders of his own design, consisting of hard pellets behind a wire mesh. Half of his experiments began with 32 mice, the other half with 56, of evenly male and female composition, and all having just reached maturity. Calhoun estimated that approximately 40 rats could comfortably be housed in these enclosures, but he would allow these populations to increase to 80 before he would cull them. Almost immediately after introduction, things began to go awry. The females, unsurprisingly, spread themselves out somewhat evenly through the pens, but after the males jockeyed for dominance and those of highest rank were determined, they began to distribute themselves strangely. Less dominant male rats will typically awaken earlier and begin to wander and forage for food, and due to the design of the pen, this meant that they usually would end up in the center sections to eat. During this time, the dominant males of the outer pens would wake up and begin guarding their respective territories.
Wait, so the weaker males spent more time eating and scavenging than the dominant males?
Since there was only one entrance ramp to either end, the dominant males of either pen would bar the return of the less dominant males, forcing the male population to clump in the center pens, while the dominant end males protected what came to be their harems. Only a few other deferential males were allowed to remain. These few remaining males began exhibiting odd behavior. Though they would spend most of their time in the burrows with the females, hiding away from the dominant male, they would never attempt to mate with any of them. Instead, perplexingly, they would try to mate with the dominant male, and even more perplexing, the dominant male would not fight these attempts. At the same time as this was happening, the effect of Calhoun's special feeders was taking hold. Since procuring food was such a lengthy process at the hard food feeders, it was common for one rat to join another while in the process of feeding. By this method, the rats slowly became conditioned to eating in the company of other rats until, eventually, the rats would refuse to eat unless another rat was present. Since more rats tended to be in the center pens, this behavior meant that, over time, more and more rats made their way there, further condensing them. This heightened the proximity of an already cramped population. In the experiments with the powdered food, this effect was far less pronounced. With these factors combined, Calhoun noted what he called a behavioral sink, or an increase in pathological activity in the rats due to the stress involved in such high population density. For the females, the behavioral sink manifested in reduced capacity for nest building and young rearing. Infant rats are extremely dependent upon their mothers for nearly all things. However, under the effects of the behavioral sink, the mothers would often be interrupted in their nest-building practices to engage in some other social activity. As time wore on, this led to sparser nests which could not house the young properly. If a mother decided to move her litter, she often would only move some of them or scatter them about the pen in separate locations.
What? Like, I kind of get the correlation, but I don't fully understand because yeah, I mean, I'm getting some of the correlation, but I don't fully understand it yet. And maybe he explains it in a second, which I imagine that's what he's building up towards, but as of right now, what I understand from it is that essentially the rats learn to socialize with each other by being in tighter groups. And instead of doing things that propagate the population, they're distracted by social behaviors instead of like their like the innate what is it called? Like the innate desire to reproduce, right? At least from the female side. And then all the beta males, let's call them, rats, all stuck together because, well, they were dominated by just a few of the alpha male rats. So they stuck together, they ate, but they were eating like what the hard pellets, like the good food. I don't know. To see it, like, I'm not fully grasping everything. Maybe he explains it.
When female rats are ready to mate,
because right now I don't
consented,
fucking know.
and the enclosed space meant that a female could not escape the continuous advances of the males during these periods. Even when they would enter their nests, continuous advances of the male them or scatter them about the pen in separate locations. What's more, when female rats are ready to mate, the males consented, and the enclosed space meant that a female could not escape the continuous advances of the males during these periods. Even when they would enter their nests for a reprieve, they would be followed in and harrowed. These factors together resulted in an extremely high infant mortality rate, in one case reaching 96%. For the males, this manifested in different ways. The dominant males would occasionally lash out in violence against the other members of the pen, including infants, often biting and wounding their tails. Among the lower class males were 3 groups. The first he described as the homosexuals, which he immediately corrects as pansexuals, who would not compete for status but would often attempt to mate with any other rat, regardless of gender or age. Much like in the end pens, these advances went unchallenged. The second group he described as somnambulists, who moved slowly through the pen without interacting with other individuals in any fashion, and the other rats, in turn, ignored them, except in rare circumstances. These rats, externally, he described as fat, sleek, and healthy-looking. But to him, the strangest group was the third, which he named the probers. These rats were hyperactive, hypersexual, and pansexual. Despite violence from the dominant males, they would viciously pursue females in heat, eschewing any sort of courtship ritual and following them into their burrows to mate. Later on in the experiments, they would often find the corpses of the improperly cared for young, which they would cannibalize. In time, one of Calhoun's assistants would publicly describe these pens as hell. At this point, Calhoun ended the experiments, but he predicted that these pathological changes would have eventually led to the deaths of the colonies. At their conclusion, he would take the 4 healthiest males and females and allow them to breed, but their behavior had been so inexorably altered that none of their pups survived beyond weaning.
So what the fuck? What's the conclusion of this experiment?
This short article enraptured its US audience, and the effects on both the scientific world and popular culture were immediate. People began to relate Calhoun's rat experiments to modern city life, and in an era where fear of social deviance was reaching an extreme high, it was largely seen as a reflection of the current time and where society could be heading, egged on by Calhoun's provocative language and allegorical design of his test environment, made to look like a city. Population density quickly became a common topic. Psychologist Carl Rogers, in his work Some Social Issues Which Concern Me, stated that, quote, "The resemblance to human behavior is frightening. In humans, we see poor family relationships, the lack of caring, the complete alienation, the magnetic attraction of overcrowding, the lack of involvement which is so great that it permits people to watch a long, drawn-out murder without so much as calling the police. Perhaps all city dwellers are inhabitants of a behavioral sink." Unquote. Soon after, studies of dense urban environments were conducted to see if these effects translated directly to humans, but what they found was inconclusive and unsatisfying. Despite the suggestions of Calhoun's rats, humans in cities reacted differently or sometimes opposite the manner that researchers expected, depending on the location. No matter how they tried, no evidence of a widespread behavioral sink could be found in urban areas. But this did not dissuade Calhoun, even as others explored the problem.
I mean, that makes sense that humans wouldn't be exactly the same, because even though we're sitting here watching this, like, I could formulate my own belief if somebody wasn't really explaining the whole picture to me, you know? I could assume that, you know, cities of humans would do very similar things where, like, and I know what you're talking about. Like, we see interviews online right now, on whether it's on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube Shorts, whatever it is. And it's asking women, like, oh, what's the most attractive thing you look for in a man? Over 6 foot tall, works out, has a 6-figure income. How many men fit that category? I want to hear what you guys have to say. Actually, I want you guys to guess right now, without looking it up, like, how many men fit that category? Just take a guess. What percentage of men fit that category? Over 6 foot tall, works out, 6-figure income. let's just say just in the US. Because if you put it on the world, it's even less. So like if you make $50,000 a year in the United States, you are technically in like the top 1% of the entire world or some shit like that. Or top 10%. It's pretty ridiculous, but just yes, in the United States. %? 100%? Yeah, all men. All men are about 6 foot tall. Yeah, like 2%. 35. You think 35% of the entire United States male population is above 6 foot tall, works out, and has a 6-figure income. Okay. So, Fizzy, you're male, and Lady, obviously, you're female. And so this is where those videos were concluding. So men would guess about 2%. Like that's actually pretty close to what the average guess was. And Lady, yours is actually really close to what most women guessed. The reality is, to be 6 foot tall, work out, and have a 6-figure income, you're at it's like 0.01% of the entire male population. So if you have 100 men, less than one of those men is going to fit that category. Less than one. So 1/10 of one of those men is going to... So out of 1,000 dudes, you're going to find one dude in that category. The issue is that it's pretty close to 50-50 male to female population. So this is kind of what this experiment is highlighting to me, is in modern times, we have an issue right now where the most women are looking for what I just described. If you just ask them flat out, like, what's the ideal man? That's what they would say. So it's not possible for that to even work unless 1 out of 1,000 men mates with, 1,000 women or 500 women. Most all my guy friends are short. I'm 6 foot on the money, so I barely make the cut. Then again, I'm you're by a military basis, so it's a large majority of men like that. Yeah. Although I was in the military, and I would say that, I was probably taller than that. Oh, yeah, you might be right, actually. Yeah, I was in the military. The people are probably on average taller. I was in the Air Force for 8 years, and yeah, most men work out in the military. It's a requirement by the military. If you don't, then it's weird. So like at least a working out category, yeah, in certain sects of the world, yeah, but they're not gonna fit the 6-figure income. So you could say like 35% of men in the military, actually it's probably way more than that in the military, that actually work out and are 6 foot tall. That might be close, 35% with those two. 6-figure income, all of them are gone except for a few that are like maybe officers in the military that have been in for like a decade, but in general, across the entire population, yeah, you've 0.01%. That's insane. There was a point in time where I was in that 0.01%. I don't have a 6-figure income currently. I will. It's coming back soon. But, and that's not me bragging. I'm just saying, like, but it's not all it's cracked up to be. Like, it's still like, so when did the world become so dumb? That's the thing. I don't think the world is dumb. I think that it's difficult for people with social media to figure out like what they're trying to do, or like what to believe, because social media, the way the algorithms work, even though they're not intended to be malicious, they oftentimes end up being malicious because it gives you what you want, and it lets you feed you things that you don't like too because you interact with them. And that's because it's an algorithm. It's binary. It's just ones and zeros. There is no emotion. There's no feeling. It doesn't give a shit. And the people that do give a shit, that are working on it, you cannot integrate feeling into it. So, I mean, there's only a certain amount of ways that it's going to work, right? So, I think that's part of the issue, is that people are just getting boxed into ideologies. Like, I like this thing. Oh, I fucking hate that thing because I see it on social media all the time. When the reality is, you could very easily see the opposite of what you're seeing and very easily switch your perspective. And that is what's happening. So people are hella confused. They don't know what the fuck to do. They don't know what to believe. They don't know who to listen to or what's going on. It causes chaos and confusion. Which makes people seem dumb, because now all their answer to questions that have nuance or require any kind of thought are just, I don't care. I don't know. And then there's people like me who I'm stimulated by these conversations tremendously because honestly, most people, we'll call them dumb, because it is dumb to not care. It is dumb to get that confused based off of like a fucking video that you saw, or like it is dumb for sure. So I think that's part of the issue, is that the people aren't, okay, let's be specific, because people aren't dumb. In fact, compared to when this guy was alive in the early 1900s, the average person understands way more about the world and just things in general than they did 100 years ago. Like science and, like religion and politics, all of it. Like, people understand things fundamentally better than they used to, on average. Yeah, exactly. That would solve actually all problems. But yeah, yeah, so I don't know. I don't care most of the time, because I've found if I try to care, it gets shut down and blocked out. But it depends what you're talking about, because right now I'm not shutting you down or blocking you out. Neither is Fizzy, but we're talking about it. I think it's fine to give a shit. I think you just have to ask questions. You need to ask questions, and if you ask questions and the person you're talking to is giving you brick wall in response to your questions, or they're stonewalling you, whatever it is, right? They're just stopping the conversation, or they don't have anything to say, then stop talking to them. They're a waste of fucking time. I know it's unfortunate to say that, but that is the current reality of the situation. So you need to move on. And I don't mean take your biases and only stick to your biases. If you're like legitimately just trying to grow and learn as a human and constantly adapt and evolve, like most people are supposed to, then doing that's fine. Because most of society are sensitive nowadays. Yeah, of course they fucking are. You know how many people have probably stopped in this stream right now and just watched for a second and were like, fuck this guy, but didn't say anything? Probably a lot. That's 90% of people lately who stonewall it seems. I guess it's probably 90% of people that it's in your life, unfortunately. And I'm not saying that's like, and maybe that's you, like, trying to come out and ask questions and realizing that you might need to change. It's harder to get other people to change when you want to. You cannot force somebody to do it. So when you're trying to change and grow and evolve, and the people around you don't care to do that, then when you ask them questions, you are going to get shut the fuck down. It's going to feel that way anyway. But that's where places like this right here, this chat, this stream, myself, I'm open and willing to have conversations about all of it. I don't care. Yeah, you live in a small... Yeah, exactly. Small town. It's difficult to get outside of your zone. I'm fortunate that I joined the military. I ended up in Japan for 6 years. Met people from all over the freaking world. I've been to Philippines, Australia, Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam. I've worked with Japanese people, and I kind of did that on purpose, though. And then I moved to Colorado, where I knew nobody. So me and my family moved to Colorado. And I met a lot of friends, explored the world even more, been all over the fucking place. Now I'm back at home. I actually lived in Oklahoma City, and I won't lie to you, I did not like most of the people that I ran into in Oklahoma City, especially after living in Colorado. It's a very different mindset. Extraordinarily different. It's really weird. And even, I'm not going to lie, even here in Arkansas, where I live now, it's very similar to OKC. So the only way to grow is to literally go outside your comfort zone and move away. Yeah, it is a cesspool. That's real. That's like actual facts. But yeah, so in regards to mass population, everybody has a phone, everybody has social media, but not everybody's fucking smart enough to realize that what they're getting fed is potentially a lie. And then when it becomes a lie, their sense of self is uprooted, and now they're like, fuck, what do I do? Nothing's real. When in reality, that's not true. It just means that what you knew is wrong, and that's okay. But that generation of people didn't grow up being told, hey, it's okay to be wrong. If you're wrong, you're fucked. You know? That's kind of the mindset. And even with my parents, like, I talk to them about stuff all the time, and my mother is fortunately the kind of person that has grown, and she's learned to understand a lot of like the principles and ideology that I come from. Like, dude, whenever Trump was running for president and all this shit, they were like, fucking this and that, because this Fox TV would be on in the background. I was just like, oh my God, will you guys stop watching Fox, please? Like, put on a podcast. Do something else to learn what, like, to understand this, because they know that, you know, they know what you guys are going to get triggered to. That's why you watch Fox. That's why people watch it. I was like, now, is a lot of this shit triggering? Yeah, it's fucking stupid. A lot of the things that are back and forth. Oh my God, dude. It was just the most toxic shit ever. I actually found myself getting entrenched in some of that stuff, and I was like, okay, I need to get the fuck out of here. That was bad. It's toxic mess and they believe stupid shit. Have you ever seen the first 48? No. Alright, do we want to finish this video? Sorry, I cut it off like halfway through and we went down a rabbit hole. I feel like we should finish this to see what the conclusion is.
Problem of overcrowding, Calhoun frantically continued his research. Now a celebrated success and emboldened by the public acceptance of his ideas, he resumed his work at NIM on an even larger scale, though again away from the public eye. He spent his time on new subjects as he continued to perfect his enclosures and experiments until finally, after 11 years, Calhoun revealed his magnum opus through an article he entitled Death Squared, which was published in the journal Proceedings of the Royal Society of Medicine in January of 1973. The lengthy opening to this article was undeniably apocalyptic. Calhoun wrote, "I shall largely speak of mice, but my thoughts are on man, on healing, on life and its evolution. Threatening life and evolution are the two deaths, death of the spirit and death of the body. Evolution, in terms of ancient wisdom, is the acquisition of access to the tree of life." Unquote. Wow. He goes on to heavily reference Revelations and of the riders of the apocalypse, using them to proclaim that the Hippocratic Oath applies not only to the body, but to the spirit. After this dramatic introduction, he described his test. For the most part, these new experiments were similar to his 1963 trials, including unlimited access to food and water, protection from the elements and predators, and safeguards against disease. Many parts, however, were drastically altered. As Calhoun mentions in his introduction, the Norway rats used in his first publicized experiments were replaced with albino house mice, which were taken from a breeding group from the National Institutes of Health made specifically to prevent communicable disease. To fit his new subjects, Calhoun had designed an entirely new enclosure. This version was much more vertical, with 16 wall-mounted housing areas for the rats at the tops of long metal tubes, which Calhoun called walk-up apartments. At the bottom of each apartment was a virtually unlimited supply of food, water, and nesting material. With the space provided, Calhoun estimated that it could potentially hold 3,840 mice. He named this enclosure Universe 25. Calhoun's methods also had changed. Rather than instituting population controls, he would interfere far less. His plan was to place 8 mice in the enclosure, 4 male and 4 female, and simply watch and wait. Calhoun observed 4 distinct phases in the ensuing experiment. Phase A was predictable, constituting the time period before the first new mice were born, which ended up being 104 days. For the mice, these days were, quote, marked by considerable social turmoil. After the social order was established and the first brood was born, the population began Phase B, which Calhoun named the exploitation phase. During this time, the mice doubled in number every 55 days as new young grew to maturity and had their own young. This doubling continued until day 315, after which the doubling rate slowed to a rate of 145 days, nearly 3 times as long. By this point, the different broods had clumped into one side of the pen, exhibiting the same sort of clumping as the Norway rats, but this time without any coaxing from Calhoun's designs. This change in the rate of procreation marked Phase C, which Calhoun labeled as the stagnation phase. This is when the most notable events occurred, and they eerily mirrored Calhoun's rat experiments. In a natural setting, those mice which find no social niche will leave the colony, but in this experiment, emigration was impossible, and so those forced to remain withdrew from society. These dejected males formed a large pool in the center of the enclosure. They quickly became characterized by both their inactivity and their many scars and wounds. Occasionally, they would grow agitated and attack one another, and with nowhere to retreat, the recipient of these attacks would simply lay still and endure the assault. The outcast females, rather than joining them, would retreat to the highest apartments and live quietly among one another. It was during this time that the behavioral sink manifested, with mice gathering around specific food hoppers in large numbers, while others remained almost entirely untouched, showing how, again, the need for social interaction had become so intertwined with the need for food that the former had overtaken the latter. The males who had won the initial fights also were placed under extreme stress. As more and more mice reached maturity from within and without, the leaders of the social groups continually had to patrol and defend their territory. Eventually, they reached the point of exhaustion and could not defend the females within their group. These females were therefore forced to defend the nest themselves, even when nursing their young, leading to generalized aggressive behavior. This aggression would inevitably be misdirected onto their young, who would be wounded by their mothers and forced to leave the nest before they were finished weaning. Much like the rats, the mother mice would also forget some of their young when moving from one nesting site to another. Due to the added stress of defending their territory, sometimes the mothers would reabsorb unborn mice in the womb, further reducing the fertility rates. Calhoun writes, "For all practical purposes, there had been a death of societal organization by the end of Phase C. Finally, there was Phase D, which Calhoun entitled the death phase. This phase was characterized largely by an entire generation of young who had been rejected by their mothers early and forced to leave the nest, and they were therefore unable to exhibit normal social behavior. This manifested in numerous ways. The females of this generation had far fewer children, and those that did have children lacked the maternal instincts necessary to raise them beyond weaning." Calhoun goes on to describe the males of this generation. Quote, "Male counterparts to these non-reproducing females were soon dubbed the beautiful ones. They never engaged in sexual approaches toward females, and they never engaged in fighting, and so they had no wound or scar tissue. Thus, their pelage remained in excellent condition. Their behavioral repertoire became largely confined to eating, drinking, sleeping, and grooming, none of which carried any social implications beyond that represented by contiguity of bodies." Unquote. As the last mice with reproductive instincts aged beyond their fertility, Calhoun declared that the last male would die around day 1780 of the experiment, effectively rendering the colony dead as it would be unable to produce any more young. His present tense language implied that, when the article was published, the colony was still technically alive, though its final fate was practically sealed. Calhoun closed his article with a call to action. For an animal so complex as man, there is no...
All right, it makes sense now. I get it. I get the whole thing. It's basically exactly what we were talking about, lady. You're talking about you're in a small town and, you know, people have their behaviors and whatever, but it's more than that in the sense that we're talking about population control. Yeah. It does reflect a lot of things that's, yeah, basically. It does reflect a lot of things that we're going through now. In the sense that, like, it sounds like we're basically in, like, phase B, phase C, kind of right now in some places, not all places. So the difference between humans and rats is that we have a conscience. We have a conscience. And in today's world, it's obviously not okay to do, like, just attack each other willy-nilly, but that doesn't take away the natural impulse to do so out of frustration. So a lot of males that, like, can't get mates, for example, because all of the females want the more alpha males, which we talked about, like, the most alpha is the 0.01% of men. And it's about a 50-50 split. So if 1 out of 1,000, let's call it like 500 out of 1,000, because they're well below halfway of even being in that category, can't even, like, are finding it difficult to get a mate, where are they going to gather? Especially now with the internet, online communities of other men that are incels that hate women because they struggle with women. And then guess what? Eventually those men are going to turn on each other because one of them is going to be like, I've actually changed the way I'm thinking. Or the narrative is going to shift again. And the people that don't get on board are going to get chastised. Now they have nobody. So it basically forces people into smaller and tighter communities of hate, essentially, because it's coming from a place of lack. And when you come from a place of lack, it's incredibly dangerous. And you always lack at that point. Forever. Until you can change your mindset, change your environment. So that's where humans are different, is that we can change our environment. You're a decision away from changing where you're currently at to a new environment. And that decision is, I'm done, here I go. And sure, is it easier for some people and more difficult for others? Absolutely. Absolutely it is. But that's just based off of that person's experience. You and I could be in the same situation, in the same town, and talk about moving, and I will actually move. Because I've already been through it. I already know it's difficult. It is what it is. Find a new job, find a new thing to do, whatever. But the other person may not. Unless they're inspired by me and go with me and I help them through it, you know? Imagine if the mice had a chance to move away, it probably would have changed the outcome. 100% it would have. Those mice that didn't fit in with society, all they had to do was be able to move on to another location. They also had no natural predators in that environment. It was just them existing. And what's happening? We don't have any natural predators right now. I mean, kind of, but not really. Like, we're not living out in the woods, though, next to bears or tigers or lions and shit, you know, like, it just, so naturally the enemy becomes yourself. But yes, you have the opportunity to move. They did not. And again, no natural predators. So the ones that were defending, that were alpha males, or the beta males that couldn't defend, that were trying to explore and scavenge, had no, you know, there was no chance of them ever dying. So now they're just confined to, you know, whatever. Humans are their own predators in the sense of murders. Well, yeah, of course. But it stems from what we just saw, you know? I mean, it could literally happen to anybody. At any time. If the circumstances were right, you know? It could easily happen to anybody.